Good evening. Welcome. It's so nice to have you here. My name's Kevin Keenan. I'm the Executive Vice President and Special Counsel of the Vera Institute, and we are just thrilled to have this exciting conversation tonight. I want to thank Citi for hosting us, and especially Ed Schuyler and Josh Moskovitz. Ed is the EVP for Global Affairs, and Josh is the Director for Global Affairs. And as you can see, this is a remarkable space, and they've been very generous with the food and drink, so we're very grateful to Citi. This conversation is exciting for a lot of reasons. We're bringing together partners from the private sector, from academia, and from the justice reform world. It's exciting because of the moment we're in and how that implicates data. On the one hand, we are at this moment of tremendous hope where we may be able to overcome many of the barriers that have held us back from understanding what's going on in our justice systems and figuring out how to fix them. And on the other hand, at the risk of instituting new processes and new uses of data that may just obscure the problems that we all know exist, where we need lots of things except another data set. I'm thinking particularly of racial injustices that are built into the system. So this will be an important and stimulating conversation. For those of you who don't know the Vera Institute of Justice, just a brief word, we are a national justice research and reform organization. Our aim is to build and improve justice systems in partnership with community and government. We do that in lots of ways. One of the ways we're especially proud of is our independent and rigorous research, and increasingly our ability to work with and wrestle down medium data and big data, including with some of the partners here tonight. And finally, we're especially proud to have such a distinguished moderator for tonight's panel conversation. Dr. Jeannette Wing is the Avanessians Director of Columbia's Data Science Institute, and she's also a professor of computer science there. She came from Microsoft, where for 4 years she was the corporate vice president of Microsoft Research, overseeing a national network of research labs. Prior to that, she was at Carnegie Mellon as chair of the Department of Computer Science and associate dean for academic affairs. And at the National Science Foundation, she oversaw the federal government's funding of academic computer science research. She's received many awards, particularly of demonstrating her expertise, are ones from the Computing Research Association, the Association for Computing Machinery, and she holds a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctoral degree from MIT. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wing and our panel for the conversation this evening.
You're so far away. Can I start? Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jeannette Wing, and let me first introduce this session. Then I will introduce the panelists, and then I'll ask the panelists some questions, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. So let me start. There's usually not a lot of transparency in the justice system. In many places, there isn't accurate, current information on who is arrested, how decisions are made, how resources are deployed, or the extent to which factors related to race or income influence outcomes. Advances in data collection and analysis hold the promise of increasing transparency, but many have sounded the alarm about the potential negative consequences of relying on big data and algorithms to guide justice reform. So this session brings together panelists from the private sector, academia, and nonprofit justice reform organizations to explore how big data is used in the justice sector, identify opportunities to expand the use of data in ways that can reduce disparities and improve the delivery of justice. We want to discuss the potential to leverage the knowledge and capacity that exists within the private sector to support this work, and the potential drawbacks and risks that should be avoided. So now let me introduce the panelists. We'll start with Jim Parsons to my left. Jim is the Vice President and Research Director at the Vera Institute of Justice. In this role, he is responsible for overseeing Vera's research on topics related to criminal justice and immigration, much of which involves the analysis of large quantitative data sets. Jim's own research focuses on the overlap of public health and criminal justice, including work on the ethical, technical, and practical aspects of information sharing between health and justice systems. Cathy O'Neill, to Jim's left, is the CEO of Orca, an algorithmic auditing company. She earned her PhD in mathematics from Harvard and previously worked for the hedge fund D.E. Shaw. Cathy started the lead program in data journalism at Columbia University and the author of the very famous book, Weapons of Math Destruction and Doing Data Science. She's also a columnist for Bloomberg View. I learned tonight that she's working on a new book, so stay tuned for that. On Cathy's left is Cameron Brien. Cam is a managing director at Goldman Sachs since 2015 and has been with the company since 2007. From 2009 to 2010, he took a year-and-a-half hiatus from Goldman and worked as an engineer at AppNexus. He received his Bachelor's of Science in both electrical engineering and applied and computational mathematics at Princeton. He wishes he majored in computer science. I say that because I am a professor of computer science. And to Cam's left is Rachael Weiss Riley. Rachael is director of Data Clinic, a pro bono initiative of the investment manager Two Sigma, which brings together Two Sigma's people, data science skills, and technological know-how to support organizations in their effort to use data more effectively. She partnered with Vera's Chris Henriksen and Jacob Kang Brown to co-author a paper exploring drivers of local jail incarceration. Rachael holds a Doctor of Public Health in Epidemiology from CUNY School of Public Health and a Master's of Public Health from Hunter College with a focus on geospatial data and modeling. So that's my great panel. And now let's get on to the questions. So let me first tell you the format. We have a lot of questions. We're not going to have every panelist answer each question. I'm going to target one panelist to start off in answering each question, and then others can chime in as appropriate. But I do absolutely want to leave a lot of time for questions from the audience. Okay, so let's start. This whole session is about transparency in the justice system. So let's first ask Jim, how transparent are justice systems? And can we use data to increase transparency?
Thanks, Jeannette. So there's clearly a lot that we could say about this. I'm going to try and be super brief. But considering the number of lives that are touched by the criminal justice system every year, there's actually a staggering amount that we don't know about the operation of the justice system. This is partly because the delivery of justice happens largely at the local level and is incredibly atomized. So there are more than 3,000 counties, more than 18,000 police departments in the US. Trying to know what's happening in all those places is just an incredibly difficult task. And the result is that that many of those systems are opaque. So we know that many cases are resolved using a plea bargain, for example, the vast majority. But if you go to any particular place, we don't know what that proportion looks like. And because pleas are so important, prosecutors hold an incredible amount of power. However, we don't know what happens within prosecutors' offices. And so that's largely a black box, so we don't know what charges are brought, what pleas are offered, what outcomes are in cases. There are 2.2 million people behind bars on any given day in the US. We don't know how many of those people are held in solitary confinement. We don't know how many violent assaults there are in prisons and jails. So just an incredible amount of missing information. And perhaps most importantly, given the fact that the discussion about criminal justice in the US has to be a discussion about race, that race and criminal justice is one of the biggest challenges facing not just the justice system, but society as a whole. We don't know how people of color and people of different races experience the justice system. We don't know how policing activity targets people based on race at the local level, and we don't know enough about their outcomes in court. So to try and address this, some of the work that Vera's done has, when there's a lack of available data, we've actually gone to paper records in some cases. We did a study with the Manhattan DA's office, and in order to know what's happening within that office, some data is automated. In some cases, we had to go to the paper records. We had someone sitting in the case room of the Manhattan DA's office, hand coding paper files so that we were able to compile information that we needed to do a study of racial bias in prosecution in that office. And so we just need all the help we can get, which is why I'm super excited to be on this panel, because I think there's a lot of capacity that exists within the private sector that we need to be able to pull into this conversation about how we can have a empirically data-based conversation about justice reform and increased transparency.
Is more and more of the data being digitized at least now, or not?
I think that increasingly information is available in electronic form, but still, when you look around the country, and particularly when you go to smaller places, they just don't have the resources to be able to do this, and so there's just big gaps in what we know.
Rachael, did you want to add some?
Yeah, so I think we need to take it one step further and talk about how we're defining transparency. I mean, I'm a big proponent of open and public data, but it's open and public is not necessarily mean that it's accessible, and even accessibility can have lots of different components to it. So when we talk about accessible, we talk about literacy, we talk about the transparency of where the data comes from and the methodology behind the data, and how easy is it to even access the data. And I wanted to take it back to the study we worked on with Vera, looking at jail census data, and Vera painstakingly went out and collected jail census data county by county, and I think that absolutely everybody involved in that process would say that that data was not accessible in any way. So I think not only does data have to be accessible and available, but we also must be careful to not inherently think that that data is going to be unbiased, or even that it's going to represent the full truth. So we need to understand, who's collecting the data, why is the data being collected, and is the data really an appropriate proxy for what we're trying to measure and what we're trying to get at? And again, to use the Vera study as an example, we were interested in understanding local jail rates, population rates, and the only measure we had was jail census data. So this was data that was reported by jail administrators, typically on, I think it's a summer day. Someone from Vera can correct me, summer day, June or July, but as you can imagine, the number of people in jail at any given time is going to fluctuate based on season, based on day of the week, based on whether or not counties are holding individuals on behalf of other counties or surrounding counties. So even that measure was a poor proxy, but we did know about it and we understood the limitations. So that's just to kind of summarize in saying that data, even if it's transparent, can be really nuanced, and I think that we should just not have blind faith in its accuracy.
Good. So let's go on to the next question. And again, Jim, you're going to start us off. What are some of the most effective uses of large quantitative data sets that you have seen in the justice system?
So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about the data that Rachael mentioned. And so corrections. So we don't know nearly enough about what happens when people are incarcerated. In terms of the number of people who pass through jails and prisons, the federal government, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, compiles information on incarceration. And that data has been really instrumental, as I think we all know, in generating a conversation about mass incarceration in the US. The idea that there has been this dramatic increase in the number of people behind bars, and also the extent to which that's been driven by racial disparities, and the fact that the likelihood of incarceration is very different based on your race. There's a couple of ways that now the federal government is collecting those data and making them available publicly. There are a couple of examples I'd like to just quickly mention about how that's being used. So many of us have heard the phrase, the way to address incarceration is to release people who are facing non-violent drug offences. And the Urban Institute, a large research organisation, decided to kind of explore that by taking the federal prison data and saying, can we use this to model different policy, sentencing policy scenarios? So they said, what would happen to the prison population if we release people or shorten sentences for some key types of offence? And as part of that, they modelled the question, if we released everyone who's in prison for a non-violent offence or a drug offence, what would it look like? And the conclusion was that we wouldn't be able to get back to pre-1980s levels of incarceration. We wouldn't be able to get to the levels seen in Western Europe. And so we really need to, the conclusion is, if we're serious about addressing mass incarceration, we have to do something differently about violence. And it was because the data were available for researchers to address these questions that really it changed the way that we're thinking about incarceration.
You mean it wouldn't reduce it to those levels from before?
Yeah. So people are talking about getting down to a level which is similar to other countries, other European countries, other countries of a similar level of development to the US. We are way off that unless we do something radically different.
Why should that be the right metric?
Because I think that there's an acknowledgement that that the reach of the justice system is reaching into too many people's lives. As I mentioned, there's racial disparity. There's not necessarily I think, an agreement of what the right number is, but I think that many people would agree that there's far too many people in prison.
And I think the point is, with the data, you can actually observe this.
Yeah, you can say, what do we need to do about it? And then just quickly, the study that Vera did and that Rachael mentioned, we were able to use the jail data to say, over time, how has the nature of incarceration changed? People carry around in their heads often that incarceration is an urban problem. It's to do with people in cities being arrested and held in jail and prison. That analysis showed us that it's not that the jail population in urban areas has been in decline, but it continues to climb in rural areas and small towns. And so, again, if we want to address mass incarceration, we need to be looking at the 2,500 small counties around the country, because that's where people are most likely to be incarcerated these days. And again, changing the conversation by having access to data. The problem is many areas of the justice system, we just don't have the data, so we don't know what's going on, so we can't have these kind of informed conversations.
I have a question, but I wanted to keep on the topic of using data and learning from, say, other sectors or the private sector on these uses. So I want to ask Cam, in the finance world, how are large data sets being used effectively?
Right, and obviously data is a huge part of the financial services sector, so I think what's interesting is to look where there's a lens for that with criminal justice reform. So one area that I think is, if I broke it into sort of three areas that are worth touching on, one is what data sets are available where we can draw inferences. To your point, very hard to come by prison population data or jail population data. So are there ways that we can go to other data sets and infer what that is? And so an example we draw from finance is perhaps there's regulatory data that we're required to publish. Are there ways that we can also infer business intelligence from something that is designed for one thing by actually looking at publicly available data? And so an analog maybe in criminal justice would be victims networks. How we publish a wide variety of data about incarcerated individuals, often for the protection of victims, and there's questions around whether that is a good or a bad thing. But you can flip that around and say, okay, so that also maybe gives us the ability to think about who is in prison and make a time series from that rather than going directly to a jail. So that's one area that's kind of interesting. The second one would be, it's so easy once you start removing yourself from the human problem to think about large data sets as something that you can just tweak and get the result you want. And so during my time in digital advertising, we would run campaigns for large advertising companies. And if you removed yourself, you could say, this campaign, this creative that we put on these websites is very, very profitable. And if you don't look at it, you might continue to run that. Or you'd look at it and say, what were the examples we drew?
For-profit colleges.
For-profit colleges and payday loans. Well, so the question there is, who's being targeted by that, right? And so I think the analog here is that we can't ignore the fact that we can draw conclusions that lead to policy decisions that at the end of the day affect real human beings. And the causality there's super important to think about. The last one I would draw maybe from finance would be we have the ability to train trading algorithms, let's say. So we have a trading algorithm, and we'll collect data over a period of time and use that to retrain it. And in the course of a day or a week, we can optimize the performance, right? And I think the challenge here is it's not clear to me that the decision-making that comes out of data in criminal justice is something we can measure in the near term, right? It's certainly not on the order of days, not weeks, probably not months. So I think there's a degree of rigor that is required here that isn't necessarily required if we bring private sector techniques to bear. In digital advertising, you might serve 100 billion ads in a day. You can learn on that very quickly. Here, if we're talking recidivism, what's the time scale on that, and how much flexibility can we take in trying things, and how radical should we be?
Yeah. Rachael, your background is in epidemiology. You want to say something about the healthcare industry?
Sure. So I want to take the question a little bit and flip it and focus on a sector, the healthcare industry, that, in my opinion, has a ton of potential, but is really lagging behind with regards to big data analytics. And it's not for lack of data. So the healthcare industry has so much data. We have electronic medical records. We have inpatient, outpatient, ED admission data. We have medical imaging and personal wearables, and we have insurance claims, et cetera. The list goes on and on. So I think that...
And soon we'll have genomic data.
Exactly. I mean, the list goes on and on. But I think for the most part, efforts have really focused on localized, small-scale projects and systems. And I think it's been a challenge. And one good example that I like to talk about is the health insurance organizations, particularly Medicare, which, for the most part, is trying to move from a fee-for-service reimbursement model to a value-based reimbursement system. And so that's, instead of providing or paying providers, which come from hospitals or doctors, individual doctors, the number of tests that they order and the number of diagnostic procedures that they write up, they're trying to understand the value of care they're providing. So they're taking patient outcomes, and they're then saying, well, if you do better than your peers, you're going to be reimbursed at a higher rate than your peers. And so it's really a win-win situation in that it's reducing the amount of healthcare that we use, and it's improving health outcomes. But as you can imagine, this is relying on the sharing of these electronic medical records, which is really challenging. And I think that the efforts to scale this type of data can also be applicable in lots of other sectors, including criminal justice, where we'd have as much information as we do in the healthcare sector. So I think that some of the problems that we're dealing with is heavily siloed data. We have data that exists in databases in different organizations. They exist on the local drives of individual computers. I mean, how are we going to get this data? How are we going to aggregate it? How are we going to clean it? How are we going to validate this data, right? There's also privacy concerns. So how are we going to make sure that this personal health information is secure? And then there's also budgetary constraints. How are we going to pay for these systems? And even more importantly, who should be paying for these systems? So I think that I certainly do not have any of the answers, but I think that these are all questions and challenges that we need to sort of address before we're able to really efficiently use data in any larger scale way.
Is there actually, I'm going off track here, but I'm kind of curious in the justice system and the kind of data that you were collecting for your study and so on. Is it common practice to share data, or is it more keep it to myself? What's the culture? So
there are actually some. So generally, there is not a practice of sharing data. And I think that there are actually, there are incentives not to share data and not to be transparent sometimes.
Is it for privacy reasons, or?
And I think also just because a lack of accountability kind of issues. But there are some. It's interesting. There are increasingly some initiatives to share data. So Florida earlier this year signed a bill which said that that required counties to share a core set of data on how their justice systems operate. And then Kim Foxx, the recently elected new DA in Chicago, second largest county, I think, in the country, put last 6 years worth of records of felony cases online. So that's a DA who's saying, I want to be transparent, here's the data. So those are few and far between, but there are instances of open data and some other places, Philadelphia, New York, but they're the exception rather than the rule.
If you don't mind me jumping in here,
please,
like,
Cathy.
I think we have to be a little bit more careful about what we mean by transparency. There's different kinds of data in the justice system. There's data about people that we consider offenders, and that's actually pretty accessible. It's often online.
It's
Mugshots.
incredibly accessible.
And then there's the data that we really want, like to what extent does this prison use solitary confinement reasonably? That's very hidden. And it's very important to realize it's about power. We have much more access to people's data who are powerless in this system, in this context, and we have very little data about people who are in power and how they're actually running their systems. So that's one thing. And then there's a third kind of data, which I'm just going to start talking about, even though it's the next question, which is crime data. We don't have crime data. We think we have crime data. And that's the biggest problem with this discussion, is we think we have crime data. We don't. We have arrest data, and we don't have crime data. Imagine what it would look like to have crime data. It would mean that there are video cameras in every single room, every bathroom, every hallway, every elevator, and there's an AI that decides whether someone's committed a crime. Nobody wants to live in that world, arguably, but if you think about the spectrum of communities, some people kind of do live in that world. People living in Harlem projects essentially live in that world. And so it's not surprising that there is more crime data around the people that have sort of historically been over-policed.
That's a really good point, Cathy. Actually, my understanding is that in China, they were putting cameras in the bathrooms to make sure people don't take too much toilet tissue paper. So,
Is that a crime, though?
is it a crime? I don't know. But, speaking of a world that we might not want to live in. But I think, Cathy, you draw some very important distinctions that we have been not careful about to make. So I will now go to the trust question. Should we trust big data? What can we learn from other sectors about the advantage and dangers of relying on large data sets? What protections should we put in place to mitigate risk? And this is a question for a math destruction author, Cathy.
Right, so I mean, the short answer is no, we should not trust it, and that we put far too much trust in it. And that comes from, honestly, people who worked in finance and have been trained in data science.
Which is both of us.
Because we honestly are the winners in these systems, and we do not understand how crime gets discovered by police in these neighborhoods where it does get discovered. So we don't have a lot of ground truth about this, but the ACLU found that whites and blacks cop to smoking pot at the same rates, but black people get arrested 5 times more often nationally, and sometimes much more than 5 times more often depending on the locality, sometimes a little bit less than 5 times more often. The point is that it's extremely biased who gets caught committing crimes. However, the people who build these algorithms, they just love playing with data, and I get it, I'm a nerd too. But it is this sanitizing effect of not actually having lived that experience, where the data scientists are building a system that they trust, and they imbue other people to trust. They imbue trust in it, and ask people, hey, this is science, this is math, don't you trust math? And as a mathematician, I consider this an abuse of the authority of mathematics. It's not okay, because what you're doing there is you're building this entire edifice upon a fake assumption. That assumption is that we have good data. We don't have good data. So yeah, it's a problem. That trust is a problem, and then once we trust something, we give it too much power. And how we see that is that we're using all kinds of, we're making very important decisions, not just in criminal justice, but who gets a job, who gets a credit card, under what conditions do you get insurance, how much do you pay for insurance, do you get fired from your job? All those kinds of things are being done with algorithms, and those algorithms are trusted essentially blindly, but the underlying data is probably biased, and if it's not biased, then there's also missing data problems. So the general feeling is, my feeling is, we need to put the science into data science. And that's not to say we stop using algorithms, but that we say, wait a second, Why should we trust this? You're telling me there's an opaque black box decision-making process, and we should throw away our human decision-making process and replace it with this black box, but you haven't given me evidence that it's working, that it's fair, and that it's legal. And until we can ask those questions and get straight answers, we shouldn't be using them.
Yeah, it's not actually an easy problem to solve technically. There has been a lot of discussion in the media and the public about biased algorithms or biased data that feed the algorithms that then produce biased models. But even defining what fair would mean is not easy.
That's right.
We also decouple the algos, right? And so to your point of hiring is obviously influenced by criminal justice status, and families are influenced to healthcare and all these knock-on effects. If you decouple each of those algorithms, you're not taking conditional probabilities even into effect.
What do you mean by that?
So if I have hiring decision, let's say I'm trying to remove bias in hiring, right? And I don't take into account the fact that we're running other data sets to make decisions in our criminal justice system, right? We have two coupled problems. My ability to get a job is heavily dependent on whether I've been maybe even just arrested, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have a bunch of data there being pulled together that allows us to make decisions in criminal justice. Those have impacts on your ability to be hired, and then we're running and trying to de-bias hiring.
I think the connection is even stronger than that. The connection is, as a data scientist, I do all these algorithms the same way. And what do? I basically pick up proxies for race, class, gender, education, wealth. Have you been a customer before? Are you high value? Do you deserve this option? And they're demographic information that I'm picking up, and I'm using them to sort of basically say, lucky people get to stay lucky, unlucky people don't get to be lucky. We're making them unluckier. So it's almost the same process in both situations. So it's much more.
It resonates.
Yeah, but it does accumulate. I think what your point was is that it accumulates, and that is a problem.
Let's go to, I guess, a specific example that has been in the news, but let me phrase the question more generally. So there's been some debate around the use of predictive risk assessment tools, and I'm thinking Compass, to inform decisions made in the justice sector. How should we be thinking about risk assessment, and are there lessons from other sectors that have successfully used risk assessment? Let's start with Jim on recidivism.
Yeah, and I'll take the first part of that question, and Cathy you already started to talk about this, but the issue is currently unfolding around the issue of pretrial decision making, and the idea is that we need to have a tool to make decisions about who is held in jail pretrial, so that people won't abscond and fail to appear. And this is really so the risk assessment issue has really unfolded in California recently, where a state bill there was. Many advocates are supportive of not using money bail. There's huge problems with money bail, basically because you sit in jail because you don't have money. And so in California, they did away with money bail, but they introduced the use of a risk assessment instead, which was used in a fairly punitive way. And so the advocates and many other commentators just entirely criticized and didn't get behind the new legislation because of this problem. And so this false assumption, I think, is we're in a system that in many places relies on money bail, decisions made by people. There's an assumption that decisions made by data is in some way more objective or some way fairer. And that's in the justice system, that's problematic for a number of different reasons. Cathy mentioned that the data that goes into algorithms that are used to predict if you're likely to fail to appear, it's largely based on previous justice system contact. We know that if you're black or brown, because of a range of racial biases in the system, you're more likely to have a criminal record. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you're in the system, the more you caught you're in the system. And so that's deeply problematic. And then there's also the definition of fairness is, you mentioned this, Jeannette, is a risk assessment tool fair if it has the same predictions for people who are black and white? Or is a risk assessment tool fair if it's efficient and so is making the best predictions? Or is it fair if it redresses the biases that you experience if you're a person of color? You could say that any of those definitions of fairness are correct. Whichever one you choose, though, has a completely different implications for whether a risk assessment tool is judged to be effective. So the challenge is, as Cathy writes about a lot, is we want to address this human bias in the system, the way that money bail is used. If we're not really careful using risk assessment tools, it could end up hardwiring the same kind of biases into the system. So there's arguments on both sides for and against the use of predictive algorithms in the justice system, but we need to be really careful as we kind of think about how
how is that playing out now, given all the articles that ProPublica has written and the impossibility results that the academic community has shown in terms of two rational notions of fairness cannot coexist? How's that playing out in the justice system?
Well, I think so. There's a couple of things happening. One is I don't know how accessible those arguments are to people who are making decisions on the front lines of whether to adopt risk assessments. And the other is there's a lack of approaches which jurisdictions can use if they want to think differently about pretrial detention. So it's not like there is a range of options available to people. It's risk assessment or money bail is often how it's viewed.
But it could be don't use that tool.
Or it could be let's use a tool to mitigate risk. So it could be who do we need to provide services to or supports to so that they will show up in court, rather than who are we labeling as high risk and then incarcerating because of these kind of biases. So there's an opportunity to flip it on its head and say let's use this as a way of supporting people rather than punishing them.
Cathy, you look like you want to say something, so go ahead.
I mean, I like that last thing. Where you're a higher risk for failing to appear. Let's get you an Uber. I mean, Why not? But I just want to mention that beyond the question, which is a very important question of like, are these algorithms fair? Are they racist? There's a question: do judges actually use them? And some of the judges I've talked to explain that they often ignore them. Then studies show that they do use them when the defendants are largely white, so there's the lower incarceration rate pretrial for whites, and then when it's the defendants are largely black, they don't use them. So it doesn't actually address the racial inequalities. And then it begs the question, does this really have to be a binary choice between a terrible bail system or a faulty algorithm system? Why isn't it just a political choice to change the rules around bail? Because at the end of the day, we could just change the rules. We don't have to take political cover with a pseudoscientific tool. I wanted to give an example of a slightly different issue, which I think is very interesting. I was speaking to a bunch of federal judges about algorithms in their courts. And one of the things that they were amazed by is that these algorithms are actually trained on arrests within 2 years of leaving prison. They're like, well, that's not how we think about whether to incarcerate somebody. Is that definition of success, being whether you're going to get arrested within 2 years? After all, a lot of the people they see are opioid addicts. Yes, they're going to get arrested because it's still going to be illegal. That's not to say they're violent criminals that need to be protected from the public. So it's in some sense just the wrong question to ask. But the thing that they were focused on, which I found really interesting, was to what extent were these risk tools going to end up being surveillance tools on them? And going back to another example, in the world of testing for kids, for public school kids, we had this sort of let's test the kids, see how much they're learning, is the standardized testing thing. It got really hardcore. And then there was this new regime, which was teacher accountability movement, where we had teachers who were fired or denied tenure based or given bonuses based on whether they were value adding to their students, which is to say whether they were getting their students' test scores above expected or below expected. That ended up being almost a random number generator, by the way. Terrible algorithm. But the point is that what started out as a thing that was supposed to sort of understand whether education was happening ended up being a surveillance tool for the teachers and a way to break the teacher unions. And so the federal judges who are appointed politically are like, hey, wait a second, is there going to be some kind of how hard are you on crime score made about me based on these recidivism risk surveillance tools? And I'm like, yeah, that's actually a really important question, especially considering how political judge appointments have become. So that's another sort of facet of this whole.
What a timely comment.
Yeah.
Let's
Jeannette, can I just jump in real quick?
Rachael.
So I just, at the risk of playing devil's advocate a little bit.
Oh, good.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we're assessing these risk tools and models sort of in a vacuum. And how, I know you talk about this in your book, Cathy, but I think it's really challenging if we're trying to understand how biased or unbiased or efficient or predictive different tools are when we're not looking at what the status quo is and whether that's improving that. And I wanted to bring up the New Jersey, I happen to live in New Jersey, but I wanted to bring up the New Jersey bail kind of experiment because a lot of things, now I'm no expert in that, but a lot of people are really happy with what that's done in reducing local jail population and pretrial population there. And there's been no uptick in crime, which everyone was worried about. And something we learned from the paper was that one of the strongest predictor, and of course that is an imperfect paper with imperfect measurement, but the strongest predictor of local jail rates was county level poverty measures. And so if people are stuck in jail pre-trial because they just simply can't afford to pay bail, and here's this risk assessment system that with also judges' discretion, but if there's a system that's reducing the number of people who are sitting there because they simply can't afford to pay bail, like that seems like a positive thing.
Sure, but you're setting up the binary. You're saying it's either a terrible bail system or it's this wonderful algorithm. And I'm saying it could just be a political choice.
That's true. That's true.
I think also there is the danger. So if you're moving from a place which is making horrible decisions based on money bail, which make very little sense at all,
right.
A risk assessment tool, fewer people may be held in jail, still be maybe the same disparities that you saw under the money bail system. But the challenge is the justice system tends to ossify. So the question is, when you introduce your risk assessment tool, if you're seeing that as a stepping stone to a fair system, one is, why not just go to the fair system straight away? And two is, are you going to get stuck with this risk assessment system, which is still biased and still problematic? And is that a good step? It's a practical step, and it's easier to implement, perhaps, than some of the political decisions which Cathy's talking about. So, that might be a reality. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's move on to another question, which is, what are the things we can do in the public sector that we cannot in the private, and vice versa? And secondarily, how can the public and private sectors work together, for example, through data sharing, which I mentioned earlier? And I thought both Rachael and Cam might want to speak to this, so either of you can start.
Go for it.
Sure. So I think the question really is not about what we can and can't do, but really what we should and shouldn't do. So I would frame it that way. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to learn from different sectors, be it public versus private or nonprofit versus profit. And I really would actually like to take the second question on. And I think that we need a call for improved collaboration across different sectors. And so I think a model for collaboration is something that we're doing at Data Clinic, which we really believe that the tools and the expertise related to tech and to data that often exist in the for-profit world can be beneficial to those in organizations who, for one reason or another, cannot afford them or don't have the resources or the expertise in-house. And so I think that the other piece of that that's equally important, and I want to stress it's equally important, if not more important, is the content area expertise that organizations, our partners, bring to the table. And so it's not this data science or data science, data analytics, big data, tech versus organizations on the ground doing the work, right? It's really this collaborative effort and this dialogue that's back and forth that's going to get us to move research to this next level in a responsible way. And I don't think there's enough focus on really having a diverse group of stakeholders in the room at the table working on these problems. And so I hope that there's more efforts that can come of that. And I think we try to do that at Data Clinic. Do we do that well enough? Probably not. But I think that's one model of collaboration. But of course, there are lots of others.
Cam, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think that the two interesting things that jump out to me, you asked what can and can't we do, right? And I think within the private sector, there tend to either be standard best practices or regulatory regimes, or maybe with social media, not so much, but there's questions around that. I think in the public sector, what's interesting to me is it's not clear what you can do and what is kosher. I'll take an example. So if you go and look at the Rikers incarceration webpage, you can search up all inmates. And it's very easy to, either through Mechanical Turk or a parser, pull all inmate records. And you could do that every day, and you could create a time series that gives you to some degree, I know we disagree on transparency, maybe what the definition is. I can't know necessarily what's happening in the prison, but I can at least know who's there. It's not clear to me whether I'm allowed to do that. And it's also not clear to me who would dictate that. So I think that's sort of an interesting question. How far can you push the boundaries? And then maybe the counterpoint to that would be, if we want to, again, I'm probably the least well-versed in the criminal justice system here. And I'm also not American, so this is all new to me. And as a Canadian, I have to tell you, and you're not, I guess, soon to be American, right?
Maybe.
It's not, from a semi-outsider's perspective, it's not until you really live here that you see how crazy this is.
How what?
How crazy this all is. It's nuts. And I'm serious. I go home and talk to my family about it, and they're like, it can't be like that. But I guess my point is, presumably, to whatever degree possible, partnerships with people on the law enforcement side, let's say, or responsible for the practice of incarceration, if we can bring them even remotely to the table to share some data, that would be valuable. And so what ways, when we think about, in finance, collaboration and sharing of data is a challenging problem, if only because people have proprietary sauce, right? And so how, from a technical perspective, we were talking about this earlier, right? How do I share data and have confidence that I might be able to sort of say, I'm sharing it with you now, but just with you. And you can aggregate it with other people, but you can't take the raw data and move it around. And I might want the right to be forgotten. How can we encourage collaboration with some techniques that might allow us to, on forward, obfuscate that?
I have a very technical viewpoint about sharing data and preserving privacy and so on, but I'm not a panelist. I'm just a moderator. But this does let me go to one of the questions that remains on the list, which is, at least let's say with respect to potential bias in our tools, but if you want to talk about data sharing, you may as well. Can technology actually solve the problem that technology actually has created? So, Cathy?
I mean, one of the things that's amazing about technology is how sanitized it seems. Like you get an answer, and even if it's not answering the question you asked or you meant to ask, it feels good to get an answer. And so I think the biggest problem we have is essentially blind spots, and we're not going to be able to solve the problems that technology creates unless we fill in the blind spots. And so the question for me then gets modified to, can we use technology to understand our blind spots? And I think the answer is essentially probably, but it's going to be hard or impossible sometimes. So just to speak about the teacher value-added model I was talking about, I don't think we have a data-driven way of measuring whether a teacher is a good teacher. We can't even agree with each other when we're talking about it as people. So what makes us think that we can create an algorithm that does it magically, especially if we don't understand what it's actually doing? You know what I mean? So there are certain things that technology was never meant to solve in the first place. And in those cases, no, we're not going to be able to solve it because it's not solvable. In other cases, I think it's like, if you think about hiring algorithms, you're like, oh, we probably have a lot of false negatives. You never hire those people. You never found out that they should have been hired. They would have been good employees. But in that case, you could set up a scientific experiment to test for false negatives, where you just ignore your own scoring system sometime and hire people in spite of the fact that they don't look like good candidates. It's expensive, because you're going to hire people that really aren't good candidates, but it is at least theoretically possible. So I think you have to think very contextually and very sort of concretely about the problem at hand.
One of the reasons I wanted to ask this question, and I don't know if the panelists want to answer, is because the tech companies are now aware of some of the potential biases that some of their models can have due to the biases of the data that's being fed to these algorithms. Even the tech companies are trying to do best effort in terms of providing tools to the public as services to do what-if analyses. And I'm thinking specifically Google, Microsoft, and I think IBM just recently have announced tools that you can use to determine fairness on particular data sets that would be fed into these models that can then be determined whether they're biased or not. So this is an attempt by the tech sector to correct, if you will, some of the very problems that they have created. That's probably where that's the genesis of this question.
Can I just quickly jump in on this? I mean, I think it's also a question of who has access to these tools. And so if it's people involved in the justice system, if it's defender organizations, if it's people who advocate on the side of people who are impacted by the justice system, then great. If it becomes an academic technical question about trying to squeeze the nth degree of precision out of a predictive tool, then that seems problematic, right? So I think it's, I mean, Cathy, you mentioned it's about power. It's about who has access to the tools and the data and be able to understand the data and use it for their own interests. And you know, I don't know the extent to which these tools are accessible.
They are publicly available tools.
Right.
That's the point. That was
the
point.
Yeah.
Jeannette, can I just jump in there too? But I think we also need to reframe the question a little bit, because technology is not necessarily creating these problems, right? It's the humans that are behind the data, that are behind the models, that are behind the interpretation of the output of the models, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that even these tools, I worry that you know, if you run your data or your algorithm through these tools and it gets a check mark, then you're absolving yourself of any sort of responsibility or blame, right? So you've cleared that checkbox, you're all set. And so, not that they're not a good thing, and I don't personally have a lot of experience using them, but I do think that when we talk about tech and data and these really kind of positive or negative really broadly, I think it's taking away from the individual responsibility that we all have to make concrete steps to improve these tools, data, technology, et cetera.
That's a very good point. I think I'd like to open up the panelists to questions from the audience. So please don't be shy. Raise your hand. We have a couple of mic runners. There's a question up front. Mike Walker's, I guess.
Wow.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Bobby Cohen. I'm on the Board of Correction in New York City. There are just 2 points, and they're sort of related to a question. One is, I think the number of trials that take place in New York State each year is around 500. So we're talking about we're 95, 98% of our pleas. So there's really, it's all in a black box in terms of that. And when we don't have any of that data, and even if I don't think Chicago is going to release it, certainly the Manhattan DA is not letting you in recently to analyze that data, and they're not giving it out. The other part is that the reason people are kept in jail in pretrial detention is punishment fundamentally. And that hasn't been part of the discussion. So just ideologically, that's critical to it. And I appreciated the discussion, but hope that you can figure out a metric to.
Was there a question?
Yeah, what's the metric to figure out the meanness in the society?
You may respond.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in because my next book is about shame. And it's exactly this point. Like, why do we imbue these fallible tools with so much power? And it's because we're like happy to shame people that have gotten arrested. And we don't actually want to give them due process. And there's all sorts of ways that we do that to teachers as well. And we, one of the teachers that I talked to, actually a principal, who asked about how does this work, was told, oh, it's math, you won't understand it. They were shamed for not being mathematicians. You know what I mean? So I think you're absolutely right. There's a power here that isn't a mathematical power that we have to grapple with.
And I mean, as your question makes clear, Bobby, is that there's this fallacy, this belief that there is due process, that there is a human process which is a trial, which allows you to come up with decisions. But this doesn't happen. People are arrested, they plea, they get time served, or they've been held in jail. And so that's just, I think, a very dangerous mix when you're thinking about applying a technological solution to this opaque and a system where there's not much kind of due process or accountability. I think it's really dangerous.
Over here? Yes, you.
I have a question for Cathy, actually. I'm wondering if you are aware of any data sets in the criminal justice world that you think are, anybody who has an opinion on this, that you think are sound enough data sets to be put to use in what you would consider to be a productive way.
Absolutely. And it's about conditional probability, actually. So what I think is untrustworthy are the way people get to prison. Because, again, we don't have crime data. And we have this very, very biased way of deciding who's a criminal, and we bring them there. Once they're there, I think we have a lot of data that we should be using, we should be collecting, and we should be using about what happens to them inside the system and what happens to them long term after they leave. Do they get rehabilitated? Under what conditions do they get jobs? Under what conditions do they return, or do they have domestic violence crimes where it brings them back to? I want to know that. And the point is that, like, I don't trust the way we get people there, but once we have them there, they're all there, and we should be tracking them. And I think of it as like an Amazon checkout line. We should be, Amazon's very good at optimizing us to sort of buy stuff and come back and maybe buy stuff that's related to the stuff. Like, and when they have bad, when they try something that doesn't work, they try something else. They fix their mistakes. Our criminal justice system should be treated in a much closer to that. But the long-term goal isn't to get everyone to buy stuff. The long-term goal, it will have to be something like, and it is a long-term goal, to Cam's point, it's very long-term, is to get there to be a less criminal society with less punishment. And, you know, right now, what we're having is data scientists who are literally given credit, kudos for optimizing to accuracy, which is to say, giving people high risk scores that make them end up returning to prison. They actually get credit for that, see? And that's exactly the wrong thing. What we actually want is less crime in the future. How do we rehabilitate people and have them have productive lives afterwards? That's the question, the long-term question we're not asking, but we have the data capacity to do that.
Quick follow-up.
So do you believe that there's no usefulness on the front end to predictive algorithms that police departments are using?
I want them to be used the way that Jim said. I want us to use them as intervention tools. Hey, we noticed that black people who are poor living in these areas don't get to their trials. Why is that? Can we give them an Uber ride? Will that help? That's a great way of using those because they are predicting something. They're not predicting criminality. They're predicting something much closer to, is your life organized enough to get to trial?
I would also just quickly jump in there and say another question that's really important is not answered is how much we are spending to punish people and keep them from success. So some analysis has been done. There's a famous New Yorker article probably 15, 20 years ago now about $1 Million Murray, a guy who was bouncing between the emergency room, the shelter, and the jail, and was costing the city literally millions of dollars. And because we can't join systems up, and because people get stuck in these emergency systems of care and jails and shelters, we're just wasting public resources, and that's a very easy policy argument to make if we can describe it using data.
Very good. Over there.
So I have a question about the pretrial tools. So when I think about the pretrial tools, it's like you have these issues of like people of certain communities getting arrested more. Then you have this issue of people of certain communities who already have priors getting arrested more. And then like there's just so many layers of bias, and as you chip away at those layers of bias, it's like the performance of your models go down, and then the actual systems that are supposed to be employing these models don't want to use it because they think it's going to hurt public safety. It's like, how do you get that buy-in that it's like, hey, like the public safety isn't like the performance that's going down on the public safety front is not as important as like getting rid of like all the layers of bias.
Right. I mean, often, the standard which tools are judged by is how accurate they are, how good they are at predicting a particular outcome, when sometimes they're creating that outcome because they're keeping people in the justice system. And so if that is your metric of success, how accurate is the algorithm, rather than how does it create some kind of positive outcome, then that's always going to be a problem, I think. And so I think we need to shift the conversation away from accuracy and towards justice and fairness when we think about these decisions.
Very good. Question over here.
I'm curious to know what kind of data is available to us about crimes committed in prison and the effects of that, whether people serve longer sentences. And I'm kind of like wondering whether there is some correlation to the fact that there are some private enterprises that are profiting off of that labor.
Yeah. Firstly, it depends how you define a crime, and so abuse and violence is fairly routine in many prisons. In fact, most prisons. That information is often not collected in a consistent way or made available, and just generally and also things like self-harm, suicide, things that happen in jail because of the conditions there in jails and prisons. That information is not well known. So it really is this black box which is lacking in transparency. I think if most people went inside a prison and experienced the conditions there, they would be appalled. And so we need these metrics so we can talk about these circumstances. I was at a talk recently by a researcher called Craig Haney, and he said that the level of optimism amongst people in solitary confinement is similar to people who are held in prisoner of war camps and people who are facing very serious terminal diseases. These are the experiences of people in prison are extremely dismal, and we don't have data on that. And it's more than 2 million people who are behind bars. This is not a small population we're talking about. It's a lot of people.
And you were talking about the for-profit component as well, right? I think I owe Jim and his team an email on this, but one of the things we started discussing is if we assume that the building of new prisons and new jails probably means more people end up in them, right? Then how do we know where that's happening, and how, to your point about shame, how can we rally people to have those conversations? So using, Google Search API, how can we pull conversations on at a local level where municipalities or counties are considering build projects and part of their budgeting, and how can we bring to bear then research and support from centers like Vera to influence those conversations? Because it doesn't help once it's built.
Mm-hmm. Back there, yes. Yes.
You had mentioned, Jim, I think it was you had mentioned, one of the complexities of gathering data is because it's very much trials and justice administered at local levels in all these counties. I'd love to hear what's an example of a state or a county or city where the data gathering is actually highly credible, and the question is why? Why is that county or city particularly good at gathering?
I think that in terms of any place that makes that data available, I think that there is hard to find good examples. I mean, I talked about the Kim Foxx, the DA in Chicago, who is making information on cases available. That is one of a small group of progressive DAs who's running now on more of a human rights and civil justice kind of platform. And so I think now, that's where the potential, I think, for change in the justice system is to have DAs who have a different set of values, a different orientation, who see and acknowledge the bias in the justice system and want to address that bias. And I think there's an opportunity that Vera and other organizations are trying to seize now of trying to nurture that community of decision makers, so there's a reason to be transparent, there's a reason to improve. But for many justice officials, there's very little reason to.
There's no incentive.
There's no incentive to make the data available. I mean, it opens them up to criticism, and many DAs or elected officials they don't want that. So.
Back there.
So first of all, for anybody who doesn't know, there's a huge amount of New York City data available, free to the public online. So if you search NYC Open Data, you can find it. But I'm curious about your thoughts about the outcome or the data that we choose to use. So we have a tremendous amount of data about the outcomes of the juvenile justice system, for example. The more intensive the supervision, the worse kids do. The more states that implemented sort of mandatory waiver laws, bumping kids up to adult court, they actually had increases in crime rates instead of decreases. And yet those are data points that we totally choose to ignore. And how we shift the conversation about the data that we do have that we're not using.
Yeah. I think part of it, I hate to come back to transparency again, but I think there's a community of researchers, of academics, of people who work in policy organizations out there who want access to data and will use those data, graduate students in school who want that data journalists, ProPublica, the Times, 538, whatever the sources are, who want data to answer questions. And so it's a question of getting it out there so that we can shine some light in the system. And I think that there is incredible potential for journalism to shine light on these problems and to kind of highlight these issues. And you're right, it's great that New York City is making, and Philadelphia is making data available to the public.
I'll jump in a little bit because, I mean, one of the things I learned from the federal judges I was talking to is that they feel very powerless because they have very little power to actually help people. Like, they're all grappling with this opioid epidemic. That's a big, big deal. And they can't actually require that the defendants that they see get treated. They simply can decide whether they're guilty or not, and then hope that they get treated. So there's, in some sense, I think the system itself is modular, like overly modular. So the people that know this isn't going to work don't actually have the power to change how it works. And I'm not an expert on how the overall system works, but I feel like there's that, going back to the Amazon example, Amazon controls its entire checkout process and everything, right? And Amazon wants to optimize to making customers come back and buy more. There's no sort of parallel analogy for the justice system. There's different people that control different parts of the justice system, and they have different definitions of success, and they conflict.
Yes, sir, over there.
Oh, okay.
I'll try this side of the room next.
First, I wanted to thank y'all for coming out and being willing to share the information that you've shared with us. So a couple of things crossed my mind throughout the discourse that has been taking place here today. The first is justice. What does that actually mean? Because if we're talking about criminal justice reform, we'd have to be able to talk about the end result, which would be what justice actually is. So based on that, my first question is, for you all, what is your definition of justice? Secondly, I've learned a saying, it's an axiom that I was taught, that the people who have the ability to produce justice don't have the will to do so, and those who want to produce justice have the will but don't always have the ability. So how do we make that a reality? Because as you stated, Ms. O'Neill, that you're probably more closer to the people who have power or a step away from the people who have the power to make the changes. So how do we go about that? And then following up with that, the third example that you gave was with Uber, cost. How do we factor in the cost? Because as Mr. Parsons stated, there's a price to do certain things, like the $1 million Harry person. Is it cheaper to maintain the system as it is, or is it more costly to undo everything to get to my original question, that justice that I would like y'all to define? Thank you.
This is a great last question, probably. So let's have the panelists take this. Who wants to start?
Everyone's looking at me.
No.
Yeah.
I can jump in. So I think
there were really 3 questions in there.
Well, I'll take the justice question because I think in the justice system, there's an assumption that people are acting on behalf of the victim. Someone has been a victim of crime, and so there needs to be some form of retribution on behalf of the victim. But the outcomes in court often don't serve the needs of the victims, and so the system is acting supposedly on behalf of a party, a victim, who it doesn't have much say in the system, in the justice system, may not guide the outcomes, and may be actually fairly unhappy and with the outcome, and often doesn't address the trauma they've experienced. So there's this system which is supposed to provide justice on behalf of someone who is poorly served. The victim's poorly served, the person in court's poorly served, and so it's an interesting question about where is the justice in that system.
Rachael.
So I think I want to jump in there too and say that justice is going to be defined differently by different stakeholders, and I think this is another argument for making sure we're putting people together who have a say in this and have a stake in this. And so it's getting together the judges and learning what they think, and getting together the data scientists and those in the criminal justice reform system and researchers and whatever. So I think there's a lot more collaboration that needs to happen to get at the different people's definitions of justice and how we can best serve them. I certainly don't have an answer for what I would do. Go ahead.
I can't say what I think justice is, but what I can say is it's very clear to me that the criminal justice system doesn't apply to a straight white male who's gainfully employed like me as it does to other people. And so regardless of what justice is, if it's not applied equally, then we'll never get to the right answer. So I think, in my mind, the most important thing is that the way the law applies to me should be the same way it applies to you, should be the same way it applies to you. And if that were to happen, the invisible hand would guide us to a much better place than we are right now.
And I'll just say that this is a question I think about all the time. And I especially think about it in the context of algorithms. And so I've been working with this ethical philosopher named Hannah Gunn on the concept of an ethical matrix. And bear with me, it's almost exactly what you just said, with a combination of what we've all been talking about. So the idea is you have stakeholders, and you have to name every stakeholder. Those are the rows of the matrix. And the columns of the matrix are their concerns. The concern of the stakeholder who is the data scientist is efficiency or accuracy. Or the concern of the judge might be false positives. You let people out of incarceration and they commit a crime, and then the judge looks bad. Trust me, judges do care about that. But the consideration of the other stakeholder, which is the defendant, is false negatives. Like, I wasn't going to commit another crime, but you kept me in prison longer. You have to consider that entire matrix. And you have to balance those considerations. And no algorithm, and for that matter, no decision-making process is going to satisfy everyone all the time. So you have to balance that idea. Just another example of that, and I know we're almost done, is like, imagine instead of a criminal justice system algorithm, you're talking about a child abuse hotline algorithm. It's another example which is being done right now in Pennsylvania. The stakeholders are the parents, the children, the caretakers, the other people as well. Think about the child worries about the false positive, which is I'm removed from my parent when I shouldn't have been. They weren't actually abusing me. That's a tragedy for the kid. Their false negative is I don't get removed from my parent, and they are abusing me. That's a worse tragedy. You have to actually say, when you're building an algorithm, how many of these are you willing to trade for one of those? That's how explicit you have to be when you embed your values into algorithms. And the whole point that I would like to make is that we are not being explicit about the values that we are embedding into these algorithms. We're just pretending that the data scientists are doing it perfectly and we can trust them. And we need to scrutinize that much, much, much more.
This is a very good point to end on, I believe, unless there's a burning question from this side of the room. Okay, so.
I'm sorry, I just have one quick one.
Okay, there's a quick question from that side of the room.
For the financial folks, what about the concept of social bonds? I feel like you have the instruments, you might be able, more than anybody else, put something like that into practice, and then that would provide the types of things Cathy and Jim were talking about, which is support and professional resources, and it would come from a place where everybody would benefit.
I mean, the one area, and again, I'm not the expert, so Jim, I think you might be able to jump in here, but bail reform is an interesting one for me, which is where there's monetary bail, what potential do we have to put up? Most of the bondsmen are predatory, right? what opportunities do we have in the financial services sector to help people post bail in a world where bail reform doesn't happen. And there's legal implications for whether people have to put up money themselves, but I think there's options there.
Yeah. I mean, in the bail world, there are interesting kind of social bond, bail bond funds that are used to pay bail. But also, I think you may be referring to social impact bonds. So the idea, pay for success financing, which I think have a place sometimes. I think the challenge is you have to be able to quantify the outcomes you're measuring. And that can, if we're not careful, get into some of the problems about being very specific and constrained about how you think about success. So an example, if you're reducing recidivism, if you're just counting the avoided prison costs of not going back to jail or prison, then that's an obvious thing to count. However, the benefits for people of not being incarcerated are far more than just not being, not just the dollar amount of being in prison. And so they tend to, if we're not careful, I think they can guide us towards a very monetary, very quantitative, limited focus on what we mean by success when we're talking about people. We can say false positives and false negatives. That has, a meaning, in a statistical meaning, but we're talking about people's lives. And so I think we need to be careful about the way we think about these issues.
I'm just going to jump in, not to mention that if you have social bonds that commodify recidivism, you can short them. Right. That's not a great idea.
I think I'd like to close. I just want to convey a couple of insights that I got from this session. One is bringing it back to the topic of the session, which is transparency in the justice system. First, the one main insight I got from the panelists is that even defining data transparency in the criminal justice system is very nuanced because of the different data, and that transparency and openness are very different. Accessibility, they're all different. The second is maybe one reason there isn't such transparency of data is the incentives are not there. And the third is something that Cathy, I think, really pointed out nicely, is that from that question, there is actually a lot of data that we could be collecting and analyzing of the criminal justice system that we're not. And again, the incentives are not there, and the data collection isn't even happening. But we could learn so much more about the behavior and the outcomes of the people in the criminal justice system and the processes themselves. So with that, the panelists, I believe, are willing to stay around for a few more minutes in case you want to ask them questions. So thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.